She was 8 years old, and she walked 5 miles barefoot across scorching Texas ground, her feet blistering and bleeding with every single step. Why? Because her mother was dying. Her father refused to call a doctor, and every adult in town told her it was none of their business. But then she reached a stranger's ranch, a widower who had lost everything, a man who had every reason to close his door and look away. What he did next would change 3 lives forever. But here's what nobody expected. The real battle wasn't saving her mother from that head injury. It was saving them both from the man who was supposed to protect them. A husband, a father, a monster hiding behind the law. This is a story about a little girl's impossible courage, a mother's desperate fight for freedom, and a broken man who found his purpose in the most unexpected way. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help. And sometimes the most meaningful thing you can do is say yes when someone needs you. It reminds us that family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up when everything falls apart. If this story touches your heart, leave a comment and tell me what you would have done. Hit that like button if you believe in second chances. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And subscribe so you never miss another story that matters. The Texas sun showed no mercy. Elias knew this deep in his bones. He had been working since dawn, moving through chores like a machine that no longer felt joy. He mended fences and checked water troughs, filling the long hours until he could pour a glass of whiskey and call it a day. The wire bit into his calloused hands as he twisted it. The man he used to be was gone. He had been buried 3 years ago, right alongside his wife Sarah and their infant son. All that was left was a body that knew how to work, and a heart that had forgotten how to feel. He was 42 years old, but looked a decade older. The Crowley Ranch was 1,500 acres of stubborn earth west of Austin. It was good land when the rains came, but this year a drought had settled in like a sickness. The creek ran low and the grass was turning to dust. The cattle were thin, their ribs showing a little more each week. Elias straightened up, a hand on his aching back. He knew he was getting too old to work the place alone, but hiring help meant talking to people. It meant enduring the pity in their eyes that made his jaw clench tight. So he worked alone. He was reaching for more wire when he saw it. A flicker of movement out in the south pasture. At first he thought it was a calf, but the shape was all wrong. He squinted against the sun, shading his eyes with his hand. It was a person. That was strange enough. The ranch was a good 3 miles from any main road. As the figure got closer, his breath caught in his throat. It was a little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, walking barefoot on that scorching ground. "Lord have mercy," Elias breathed. And then he was running. His boots hit the hard-baked earth, and with every step the picture became clearer and more horrifying. She wore a faded blue dress that was too big for her. Her dark hair was a tangled mess, but it was her feet that made his stomach turn. They were raw and blistered, leaving small, bloody prints in the dust with every step she took. Yet she kept coming. Her eyes were dark and huge, and her small face fixed on his house with a desperate intensity. "Hold on," Elias called out. "Just stop there, sweetheart." But she kept walking until her legs finally... Elias kicked open the door to his solid-built ranch house and carried the little girl straight to the kitchen. He set her down gentle-like in a chair. "Water," she whispered, her voice barely there. "Slow now," Elias warned, pumping a tin cup full at the sink. "Just small sips." She drank like she was dying of thirst, her hands clutching that cup with a desperate strength. He had to pull it away from her after a few swallows. "More in a minute," he promised. "Let that settle." He pumped water into a basin, grabbed some clean rags, and knelt in, a deep anger for the people who let this happen. A rage at a world that could break a child like this. And a hot shame for himself for every time he'd seen trouble at the neighbor's place and looked away. He had told himself it was not his business. "What's your name, little one?" he asked, his voice low as he tied the last bandage. "Maggie," she whispered. "Maggie Rowe." "I'm Elias Crowley. This is my ranch." He looked at her small, determined face. "Maggie, where are your folks?" Fear flashed in her eyes. She looked down at her wrapped feet. "My mama's sick," she said. "Real sick. Papa won't call the doctor and nobody else will listen. I saw your ranch from the road one time. Mama always said that sometimes strangers are kinder than your own people." Her words spilled out in a rush. "I just didn't know where else to go." "Hush now," Elias said gently. "You did the right thing. You were brave to come here." He stood up, his old knees cracking, and refilled her cup with water. "Now I need you to tell me exactly where your mama is and what's wrong." "We live in the old Hendricks place about 5 miles east of here," she began, her eyes locked on his. "Mama fell 3 days ago. She hit her head hard on the stove. She's not right, Mr. Crowley. She can't stand up. She gets sick if she tries to eat, and sometimes she don't even know who I am." Maggie's voice trembled. "Papa just says she's being lazy, but she's getting worse, and I'm scared." Her strength finally gave way. Tears streamed down her face as she let out sobs that she had clearly been holding in for days. Elias knelt in front of her again, his big, rough hand resting gently on her shaking shoulder. "Listen to me, Maggie. We are going to get your mama a doctor. But tell me first, where is your father right now?" "He went to Austin. Won't be back till tomorrow. Maybe later," she mumbled, wiping her nose with her arm. "That's why I ran away today. He wasn't there to stop me." A cold, hard purpose settled in Elias's gut. A woman with a head injury getting worse for 3 days, a child terrified of her own father. He stood up, his mind made. "All right, you rest here while I get the wagon ready. We're going to get your mama, and we are bringing her back here so Doc Harrison can see her." Maggie's eyes grew wide. "But Papa, your papa is not here," Elias stated plainly. "And your mama needs help right now." He looked at her. "Are there any other children at home?" She shook her head. "Just me and Mama." "Good. That makes things simpler." Elias went to the pantry and got a tin of crackers and a jar of peaches. "I want you to eat a little something while I'm gone. Don't you worry now." "I can help," Maggie said, trying to stand on her sore feet before sinking back down. "You've already done the hardest part, little one," Elias told her. "You were brave enough to ask for help. Now let me handle the rest." He went out to the barn and prepared the wagon, his movements quick and sure. He knew the Hendricks place, a tough piece of land that broke more men than it made. He had heard the stories in town about Roe, about his mean streak and his heavy hand. People would whisper about it, then shake their heads and say it was family business. Elias had been one of them. He had heard the talk and told himself it was not his concern. He would not make that mistake again. When he came back inside, Maggie had eaten a few crackers. She looked up at him with a desperate hope in her eyes that no child should ever have to carry. "Ready?" he asked. She just nodded. He carefully lifted her onto the wagon seat, making sure her feet were comfortable. The afternoon heat was still heavy as he clicked the reins and the horses started to pull. 5 miles east, you said?" "Yes, sir. You'll see a big oak tree that was split by lightning. Our road is right after that." They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds being the creak of the wagon and the steady plodding of the horses. "Mr. Crowley?" Maggie's voice was barely a whisper. "Are you going to get in trouble for doing this?" "Probably," Elias answered honestly. "But some things are worth getting in trouble for. Papa gets real mad when folks interfere." "I'm sure he does," Elias said, his eyes fixed on the road. "But right now, all that matters is your mama." They found the lightning-scarred oak tree just like she said. He turned the wagon down a dirt track that was barely a road at all. The land out here was hard and unforgiving. The cabin came into view, and it was a sorry sight. It was a one-room shack, sagging to one side, with a roof full of holes. This was not just a poor man's home. This was a place where a man had given up completely. Elias stopped the wagon. "You wait here," he told Maggie. "Let me go in first." But she was already scrambling down, her hurt feet forgotten. Mama's in there. I need to tell her you're here to help. Elias gently stopped her. Maggie, listen. Your mama might be confused from her injury. Let me go in first and see how she is. You wait here for just 1 minute, I promise. She looked like she wanted to argue, but then she nodded. The cabin door was hanging off its hinges. Elias pushed it open and a terrible smell hit him. Sickness and neglect. Inside, the room was dark and miserable, and on a small bed against the far wall, he saw a woman. He walked over to her. Her breathing was fast and shallow. Her dark hair was matted with dried blood from a nasty gash on her temple. The skin all around it was a dark, ugly purple. Mrs. Rowe, Elias said softly. My name is Elias Crowley. Your little girl came and got me. I'm here to take you to a doctor. Do you understand me? Her eyes opened a little. They were the same deep brown as Maggie's, but they were clouded over with pain and confusion. Have you ever seen something so wrong you knew you had to act, no matter the cost? That is what this story is about. It is about a little girl with blood on her feet, a woman left for dead, and a good man who refused to look away. Elias found the woman in a daze, her eyes blank. He told her, I'm going to lift you now. She felt like a feather in his arms, a life barely holding on. As he carried her out, she whispered her daughter's name. Maggie, she said. Where is Maggie? Elias answered gently. She is safe. She is right outside. In the wagon, he laid her mother down on a pile of blankets. Little Maggie climbed beside her, holding her hand and whispering, Mama, it is me. You're going to be okay now. Mr. Crowley is going to help us. The woman's eyes fluttered open to look at her daughter. Baby, she breathed. Your feet? Maggie shook her head. They are fine, Mama. Do not worry about me. The ride back to the ranch felt 100 miles long under the setting sun. Night was falling by the time they reached the Crowley ranch. Elias carried the woman inside and placed her in his own bed, the one he had not used since his wife Sarah died. He had been sleeping in a small room off the kitchen, unable to face the memories. But as he pulled the quilt over the stranger, he thought Sarah would have approved. She was always the first to help someone in need. He turned to Maggie. I am going to ride to town for Doc Harrison. There is food in the kitchen. Stay with your mama. I will be back as fast as I can. The trip to town should have taken an hour. Elias made it in 40 minutes, pushing his horse hard. He banged on the doctor's door until a light flickered on. What in blazes? Doc Harrison called out. The doctor's anger vanished when he saw Elias's face. What happened? Elias said. Head injury, 3 days old. A woman, maybe 30 years old. She needs help now. Harrison grabbed his medical bag without another word, and they rode off into the night. Back at the ranch, the doctor examined the woman while Elias and Maggie waited in the kitchen. The little girl stared at the bedroom door, her feet bandaged and propped on a chair. Finally, Doc Harrison came out, his face like stone. He spoke to Elias in a low voice. She has a major concussion, maybe a skull fracture. There is bleeding in the brain. You said this happened 3 days ago? She should have been seen right away. The doctor's voice was tight with fury. Will she live? Elias asked. Maybe, Harrison said. But there could be lasting damage, memory loss, trouble moving or speaking. It is too soon to tell. He paused. How did this happen? Elias explained what the girl had told him. Her daughter says she fell and hit her head on the stove. The husband did not bother to get help. The doctor's jaw set hard. Where is he now? In Austin, due back tomorrow. Elias looked the doctor square in the eye. I took her from their home without his permission. The girl walked 5 miles barefoot for help because nobody else would listen. Good, the doctor said, his voice flat. Because if you had not, that woman would be dead by morning. She needed to be completely still for at least a week, maybe even longer. Dr. Harrison was firm about it. Absolute rest, with someone watching her constantly in case things took a turn for the worse. Elias didn't hesitate. "She can stay right here," he said, "for as long as it takes. And when her husband shows up, he and I are going to have a talk." Harrison looked at him, his eyes knowing. "Elias, I have known you since you were just a boy. You are not a violent man, but I see where your thoughts are headed." He put a hand on Elias's shoulder. "Do not do anything that will put you behind bars. That little girl in there," he nodded towards the kitchen, "she has already lost too much. Do not make her lose the only person who offered a hand." "I will not," Elias promised. "But I will not let him drag them back to that place." Harrison gave a slow nod. "I will file a medical report with the sheriff. I will document her injury, the delay in getting care, and the condition I found them in. It might not be much, but it is a start." He grabbed his bag. "I will be back tomorrow. If anything changes, you send for me right away. Do you understand?" "I understand." After the doctor left, Elias walked back to the kitchen. Maggie was still in the chair, her gaze locked on the bedroom door. "Your mama's going to stay here with us for a while," Elias told her softly. "She needs to rest up and get strong again." Maggie nodded, silent tears rolling down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for helping us." Elias knelt down beside her, feeling a little clumsy. It had been 3 years since he had been around a child, since he had tried to comfort one. But this little girl had walked 5 miles across scorched earth just to ask for help. "You do not have to thank me," he said, his voice low. "You did the hardest part. You were brave when it counted most." "I was scared," she admitted. "Being brave does not mean you are not scared," he told her. "It means you do what needs to be done, even when you feel that fear." He stood up, his knees groaning. "Come on now, let us get you settled." He carried her to the small spare room, just big enough for a cot and a washstand. He gently placed her on the bed, propped her feet on some pillows, and brought her a glass of water and the rest of the crackers. "Try to get some sleep," he said. "I will be right outside if you need anything. What about you? Where are you going to sleep? The sofa will do just fine." He left her and went to check on Mrs. Rowe. She was sleeping, her breathing a little easier now. He adjusted her blankets, then went back to the front room. The sofa was old and a bit too short, but he had slept in far worse places. He stretched out, listening to the old house groan and settle around him. For 3 long years, he had been all alone in these rooms, surrounded by ghosts of the family he had lost. He had told himself it was easier this way, that you cannot lose what you do not allow yourself to have. But now, a sick woman was in his bed and her daughter was in the spare room. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring, other than trouble. And for the first time in 3 years, Elias Crowley felt something other than numb. He felt needed. It was a terrifying feeling. But underneath that fear, there was something else, something that felt a lot like purpose. He closed his eyes and prayed, not to the God he learned about in church, but to his Sarah, the woman who had taught him that kindness was what mattered most. "I do not know what I'm doing," he whispered into the dark, "but I'm going to try. For that little girl and her mother, I am going to try." The house was silent, but Elias felt like a door that had been locked for 3 years was finally starting to creak open. Tomorrow would bring a storm of its own. There would be questions and a reckoning when the father came looking for them. But tonight, 2 people who had been lost and alone were safe and warm. For now, that had to be enough. Elias pulled the thin blanket over his shoulders and let sleep take him, with one last thought. Let me be strong enough. In the small room, Maggie lay awake. Her bandaged feet ached, but for the first time in a long, long time, she felt safe. The man in the other room had promised to protect her mother. And somehow Maggie believed him. She closed her eyes and whispered a simple prayer. "Please let Mama be okay. Please let us stay here." Outside, the vast Texas night sky stretched over the ranch, indifferent to the small human dramas below. But inside the house, 3 broken souls found a moment of peace. bound together by a simple act of kindness. The morning light came too early, finding Elias already awake on the sofa. He moved quietly through the house to check on his guests. Mrs. Rowe was still asleep. In the little room, Maggie was curled up under the quilt. He watched her for a moment, this child who had walked through fire for her mother. Then he went to the kitchen and started the coffee, the familiar routine, a small comfort. He was pouring a cup when he heard a noise from the bedroom. He found Mrs. Rowe awake, her eyes wide with confusion. "Easy now," Elias said softly. "You are safe. You are at my ranch. Your daughter, Maggie, she brought me to help you." Her eyes found his. "Maggie," she whispered. "Where is she?" "She is sleeping. She is all right." He poured her a glass of water. "Can you drink a little?" She took a few sips before her head sank back into the pillow. "I do not remember," she murmured. "How did I get here?" "You hit your head 3 days ago. Do you remember that?" A shadow of fear crossed her face. "The stove. I was reaching for a pot, and then everything just went black." I woke up on the floor. Her voice was thin like a worn-out thread. "Thomas was mad. He said I was clumsy." Thomas. That was the husband's name. Elias made a mental note. "You have a bad concussion, Mrs. Rowe. The doctor said you need to rest here for at least a week, maybe more." "I cannot," she said, panic in her voice. "Thomas will be furious that I left. He will want me back home, back to work." "Thomas is not here," Elias said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And when he shows up, he and I will have a little conversation. Your only job right now is to get better." She looked at him, her eyes filling with tears. "Why are you doing this? You do not even know us." "Your daughter walked 5 miles barefoot just to ask for help," he said. "That tells me everything I need to know." A sob escaped her. "She should not have had to do that. She is just a little girl." Little. The effort was too much for her. Her eyes fluttered closed. "Shh," Elias soothed. "Do not work yourself up. Just rest. Maggie is safe. You are safe. That is all that matters." He sat with her until she drifted off again, then went back to the kitchen. He found Maggie awake, sitting at the table, her bandaged feet propped on a chair. On the chair. "Is Mama awake?" she asked, her voice just a whisper. "For a little bit, she was asking for you." Elias poured his coffee, then got her a glass of milk. He set out some bread and the last of the peach preserves. "You need to eat," he said gently. "Then we gotta talk before your father shows up." Maggie froze, her hand hovering over the bread. "He's gonna be so mad." "I reckon he will be," Elias agreed, sitting down across from her. "But I need to know what I'm walking into, Maggie. Does he hurt you? Your mama?" The silence in the kitchen felt heavy and sharp. Finally, Maggie gave a tiny nod, her eyes fixed on the table. "For how long?" "Always," she whispered. "As long as I can remember." It got worse out at the Hendricks place. "He's drinking more. Blames Mama for the bad land, for us never having enough money." She looked up at him, her eyes pleading. "But she works so hard, Mr. Crowley, from sunup to sundown, even when she's sick." "I believe you," Elias said, his voice soft but firm. "And what your father is doing is wrong. A man doesn't treat his family that way, no matter how tough things get." "I know," she choked out. "But knowing don't change it. Nobody ever helps." "Well, I'm helping now," Elias said quietly. "And I'm not backing down." Tears welled up in Maggie's eyes. "But what if he just takes us back? The law says he can." It was a good question, one that had kept Elias up all night. Around here, a man's family was his own business. The sheriff wasn't likely to step in. "We'll cross that bridge when we get there," he said. "Right now, your mother needs a doctor, and that's something she can't get at home. That buys us some time." The morning was quiet. Elias did his chores, checking on the cattle and the low water supply. When he got back to the house, Maggie was sitting by her mother's bed, reading to her from an old school book. Mrs. Rose's eyes were open, and she even managed a weak smile for Elias. "She reads real good," she whispered. "I taught her." I can tell, Elias said, then turned to Maggie. Your mama needs to rest now. Why don't you come give me a hand in the kitchen? Maggie followed him out, and Elias put her to work peeling potatoes for supper. It was simple work she could do while keeping her feet up. They worked in a comfortable silence for a bit before Maggie spoke up. Mr. Crowley, what if Mama don't get better? Elias stopped cutting vegetables. The doc seems to think she will. Just needs time. But what if she don't? Maggie pushed. What if she... Her voice trailed off. Then we'll figure it out, Elias said with a steady voice. Whatever happens, we'll do it together. You're not alone anymore, Maggie, you understand? She nodded, but he could still see the fear in her eyes. Doc Harrison stopped by that afternoon. After checking on Mrs. Rowe, he came into the kitchen looking a little more hopeful. She's holding her own. Seems a bit clearer today, knew her own name. That's a good sign, he said, setting his bag down. But she's not out of the woods. The next few days are real important. What should I look for? Elias asked. Seizures if she gets more confused or if you can't wake her up. Any sign of the husband? Not yet. When he comes, you call the sheriff right away. Don't try and handle a man like that on your own. I won't start nothing, Elias said carefully. But I won't let him take him back either. The doctor looked at him hard. You know you could get charged with kidnapping, right? Taking another man's family. I took a hurt woman to get help. Her little girl asked me to, Elias stated plainly. And that's how I'll tell it, Harrison agreed. I've already written down how I found him. But you be careful, Elias. Men like Thomas Rowe are mean, and the law ain't always on the side of what's right. After the doctor left, Elias made a simple supper of beef stew. He helped Mrs. Rowe sit up and take a few bites of broth. You're too kind, she whispered, her eyes full of fear. Thomas will have to get through me, Elias said, his voice low and steady. I promise you, Mrs. Rowe, long as you're under my roof, he won't lay a hand on you or Maggie again. Tears streamed down her face. Why? Why do you even care about us? Elias was quiet for a long moment. Because 3 years ago I lost my wife and my boy, he said, his voice thick with old pain. They got sick, and there wasn't a blessed thing I could do to save them. I couldn't help my own family, but I can help you, and maybe that's enough. Maybe... Mrs. Rowe reached out a trembling hand and touched his arm. Thank you, she whispered. That night, Elias lay on the sofa, listening to the house settle. It wasn't empty anymore, and even with the trouble coming, he felt grateful. The next day was a scorcher. Elias was in the barn when he heard a horse coming hard. He walked to the entrance and saw a lean, hard-faced man ride into the yard. The man's eyes darted around, sizing everything up. It had to be Thomas Rowe. Elias walked out to meet him, keeping his hands open and relaxed. Can I help you? The man swung off his horse. I'm looking for my wife and daughter. Heard they might be here. Who told you that? Doc Harrison. Said he treated my wife for a head injury. His eyes were cold as ice. Said I'd find her here with a nosy neighbor. Your wife has a bad concussion. She needed a doctor, and it was plain as day she wasn't getting that care at home. Rowe took a step forward. What my wife needs is none of your business. Where is she? Elias stood his ground. She's in bed, resting under doctor's orders, and I'll be taking her home now. No, Elias said, his voice quiet but firm. You won't be. Rowe's face turned to thunder. That's my wife, my daughter. You ain't got no right. I have every right to keep an injured woman from being moved before she's healed, Elias said evenly. Your wife stays here till Doc Harrison gives the okay. That's the long and short of it. The hell it is, Rowe growled, his hand moving toward the knife on his belt. I don't know what game you're playing, Crowley, but you're going to step aside. Can't do that. Then we've got a problem. We surely do, Elias agreed. But it won't be settled with that knife. Your wife needs medical care. Your little girl's feet are burned raw from walking 5 miles barefoot just to get help. They're staying put. Roe let out a nasty laugh. They don't get to decide nothing. They're my property, same as my horse. The ugly words hung in the air. That's where you're wrong, Elias said, keeping his hands loose at his sides. They're people, and people have rights. Are you fixin' to preach at me? Rose spat on the ground. I think I know what's really going on. You got your eyes on my wife. Play the hero and maybe she'll be grateful. Elias moved in a flash, grabbing Roe by his shirt. You say one more word like that and I'll... You'll what? Rose snarled. Hit me. Go on. Let's see what the sheriff says about you assaulting a man trying to get his lawful family. Elias forced his hands open and stepped back. Get off my land. Not without my wife and daughter. Then I'll have the sheriff remove you. It's your choice. Leave on your own 2 feet or in cuffs. Rose's eyes narrowed. You really want to bring the law into this? I can tell them how you stole my family, keeping them here against their will. Elias just shook his head. Against their will. Your daughter walked 5 miles on blistering hot ground. She was so desperate. Your wife had a 3-day-old head injury because you wouldn't fetch a doctor. You want to have that conversation with the sheriff? For just a second, real doubt flickered in Rose's eyes before he hardened again. A man's got a right to run his own house. There's a law against neglect. There's a law against endangering a child. She ain't dying, just a bump on the head. She has a skull fracture and bleeding on the brain, Elias stated plainly. Ask Doc Harrison if you don't believe me. Another day or 2 and she'd have been gone. Rose stood there, his face a storm of unreadable feelings. Finally, he asked, How long? How long till she can travel, Elias clarified. The doc says a week at the minimum, maybe longer. Roe chewed on that for a moment. And I'm supposed to just leave him here with you? I expect you to do what's best for your wife, Elias said. Trust has nothing to do with it. After a long, tense silence, Roe gave a slow nod. Fine. 1 week. But I'll be checking in. And if I find out you've put ideas in her head, she'll get medical care and a safe place to heal, Elias cut him off. Nothing more. Roe swung up on his horse, his eyes full of hate. 1 week, Crowley. Then I'm taking my family home, and ain't nobody gonna stop me. He spun the horse and galloped off, leaving Elias standing alone in the dust. Elias went inside only after the shaking in his hands had stopped. He found them in the bedroom, their faces etched with fear. Was that Papa? Maggie whispered. Yes. What did he want? Mrs. Rowe asked, her voice a tremble. He wanted to take you home. I told him you weren't well enough. He's agreed to wait a week. A week? She repeated, her voice hollow. And then what? Elias pulled a chair near the bed. Mrs. Rowe, I have to ask you something. Do you want to go back to him? She closed her eyes. What I want doesn't matter. It matters to me. He's my husband. I made vows. He made vows too, Elias said gently. To honor and cherish you. Has he done that? The tears finally came. No. Then you don't owe him a thing. It's not that simple, she sobbed. I have no money, nowhere to go. Maggie needs a father. Mama, no, Maggie said, her voice fierce. I don't need him. I need you to be safe. I need you alive. Mrs. Rowe reached for her daughter. You don't understand. I understand that he hurts you, Maggie cried. I understand we're safer here with Mr. Crowley than we've ever been. Please, Mama, don't make us go back. Elias slipped out of the room, leaving them to their tears. He sat on the porch steps, head in his hands. He had 7 days to figure out how to protect them from a man who held all the legal cards. 7 days to find an answer that wouldn't end with someone in jail, or worse. He was still wrestling with it when Doc Harrison arrived for his evening visit. The doctor checked on his patient, then joined Elias on the porch. "She's improving," Harrison said. "Slowly, but it's progress." "That's good," Elias said. But the doctor heard the trouble in his voice. "Thomas Rowe paid a visit today. He gave us 1 week." Harrison was quiet for a long time. "There might be a way," he said finally. "It ain't a sure thing, and it would need Mrs. Rowe to be brave." "Have you ever heard of the Married Women's Property Act?" Elias looked up. "No." "It's new law," the doctor explained, "passed just last year. It gives a wife some limited rights. More important for us, it allows a wife to petition the court for a legal separation on the grounds of cruelty." Separation? Hope flickered in Elias's chest. "It's not a divorce, but it would be a court order, protection. She'd have to prove his cruelty, but I'd say her injuries are powerful evidence." "Would she get to keep Maggie?" "Most likely. The courts usually side with the mother when the father is unfit." "What would she have to do?" "File a petition. It means a hearing before a judge with testimony from witnesses. You, me, maybe Maggie." "How long would that take?" "Weeks, maybe months. But in the meantime, she could ask for a temporary order of protection, an order telling Rowe to stay away while the case is decided." "And if she got that order," Elias asked, leaning forward, "could he still take her in a week?" "Not legally," Harrison said, a small smile on his face. "But understand, Elias, this would be a fight. Thomas Rowe won't take it lying down. Is furious. He could make a whole mess of trouble." "It's a chance," Elias said. "It's more than they had before." "Just talk to her," the doctor advised. "Make sure she knows what she'd be getting into." After he left, Elias stood on the porch, watching the sun burn its way down. 7 days. 1 week to convince a scared woman to face her husband in court. 1 week to decide if he was willing to risk everything for them. He thought about little Maggie, walking barefoot across that hot, scorched ground just to find help. If an 8-year-old girl could be that brave, then a grown man ought to find the strength to stand with her. He squared his shoulders and went back inside the house. Mrs. Rowe was sitting up in bed with Maggie curled beside her. They both looked at him with the same tired, hopeful expression. Elias pulled up a chair. "I've been talking with Doc Harrison," he said, his voice steady. "It seems there might be a way for you to stay away from him for good, legally from your husband. It won't be easy, mind you, and there are no guarantees, but it is possible." Elizabeth's hands clenched the quilt. "How?" "A new law. The Married Women's Property Act. It lets a wife take her husband to court for cruelty. You would have to stand up and tell the judge what he has done. If he believes you, Thomas would have no more claim on you." The room fell silent, thick with a mix of fear and hope. "Testify?" Elizabeth whispered. "In front of everyone? In front of him?" "Yes." "And tell them my husband beats me? That he let me lie on the floor with my head split open? Do you have any idea what folks would say?" Her voice was getting high and shaky. "They'd call me a troublemaker. A woman who drove her own husband to it. They'd say I deserved every bit of it." "Some might," Elias said calmly. "But the law doesn't listen to gossip. It listens to facts. And we have plenty of those. Your head, Maggie's feet, the shape Dr. Harrison found you in. He is willing to speak for you, so am I." "Why?" The question flew from her lips. "Why would you get tangled up in our mess? Risk your good name for us?" Elias thought for a moment. "Because it is the right thing to do," he said plainly. "Because a little girl should not have to walk 5 miles barefoot for help. Because you shouldn't have to choose between a man who hurts you and the street." He leaned in, his voice firm but kind. "And maybe, just maybe, because I know what it is to lose family and not be able to do a single thing about it. I could not save my wife and son, but I can help you, if you will let me." Elizabeth covered her face, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Maggie wrapped her arms around her mother, giving Elias a look of pure gratitude. "I am so scared," Elizabeth whispered. "He will make me pay for this." "He cannot touch you if the law says he has to stay away," Elias explained. "That is what a protection order is for. Once we file, the judge can order him to keep his distance. If he breaks that order, the sheriff will arrest him." Elizabeth looked at him, her eyes red. "You make it sound so simple." "But you don't know him," she insisted. "You don't know what he will do when he feels cornered." "I saw the look in his eyes," Elias said. "I know he is dangerous, but doing nothing means going back to that life for you and for Maggie. Is that what you want?" "Of course not," she snapped. "But I have no money. I have no skills besides keeping a house. Where would we go? How would I even feed my daughter?" The question hung in the air, cold and hard. It was the trap that kept so many women stuck. A woman alone with a child had few choices, and none of them were good. "You could stay here," Elias heard himself say. The two of them stared at him, stunned. "Here," Elizabeth breathed. "On the ranch. I need the help. This place is too much for one man. You could run the house and the garden. Maggie can help as she gets older. I would pay you a fair wage, enough to save for your own place if you decide to leave." "You cannot be serious," she stammered. "It would be improper. A man living alone with a woman separated from her husband." "The gossip. Let them gossip," Elias cut in. "I am offering you honest work and a safe roof over your head. What other folks want to imagine is their own business, not ours." "Mama, please," Maggie begged. "Please say yes. Do not make us go back there." Elizabeth looked from her daughter to Elias. "This is crazy. You are offering to shelter us, to fight my husband, to risk your own safety for two people you met just 3 days ago." "4 days, actually," Elias corrected gently. "And yes, I know how it sounds, but I am doing it." "But why?" she asked again, desperate to understand. "Because someone has to," he said simply. "And I am here, and I can. That is reason enough." The tears finally came, streaming down her face. "I don't even know your first name," she said with a broken laugh. "All this time, and you are offering to turn your life upside down for us." "It is Elias," he said softly. "You can call me that if you're staying." "I have not said yes yet." "But you will?" he said. It was a statement, not a question. Elizabeth wiped her cheeks. "What is your first name?" she asked. "It is only fair. Mine is Elizabeth." "I did not know that," he admitted. "I have just been calling you Mrs. Rowe in my head." That got a small, watery laugh from her. "Elizabeth Ann Rowe. Though I suppose I will not be a Rowe for much longer if this works." She took a deep breath, then looked at Maggie. "Sweetheart, this will change everything for us. I need to know what you truly think." Maggie's small face was serious. "I think, Mr. I think Elias is the first person to ever help us for no reason. I think you're getting stronger here. And," her voice trembled, "I want to stay somewhere. I do not have to be afraid." Elizabeth hugged her daughter tightly. When she looked up, her eyes were clear. "All right," she said. "Tell me what we need to do." Elias felt a wave of relief. "Tomorrow I will ride to town and see a lawyer. We will file for the separation and the protection order. We will also need to give a statement about the abuse," Elias continued. "It will be hard." "None of this is easy," Elizabeth replied. "But we will do what must be done." "One last thing," Elias added carefully. "The lawyer needs to know you will be staying here and working for me. People will talk. They will suggest things that are not true. We have to be ready for that." Elizabeth lifted her chin. "Let them. We know the truth. That will be enough." The next morning, Elias rode into the blistering heat of town. He stopped outside the office of Jacob Winters, the only lawyer around, known for taking on tough cases. Winters was a silver-haired man in his late 50s with sharp eyes that had seen it all. He listened to Elias's entire story without a word, his hands folded on his desk. When Elias finished, Winters was quiet for a long moment. "This will be a fight," he said at last. "These new laws. Well, the judges can be unpredictable. We will need to build a case that is as solid as a rock." "We've got a strong case," Winters said. "We have the doctor's report, his testimony, and the shape that little girl was in. But we have to deal with the big problem here. You're a widower taking in a married woman. Her husband's lawyer will paint a nasty picture of an improper affair. He'll say you're trying to steal another man's wife. That's a lie. The truth doesn't matter. What the judge believes is all that matters," Winters said, leaning back. "We need people to speak for you. Neighbors, friends, anyone who can vouch for your good character. Can you find folks like that?" Elias thought about the last 3 years, how he'd kept to himself and pushed everyone away. "I can try." "Trying won't be enough," Winters stated plainly. "This whole thing comes down to 2 points. First, proving Thomas Rowe is a danger to his family. Second, proving you're helping out of kindness, not for some other reason. If we can't make the judge believe both, he'll send her right back to that man." The words hit Elias like a punch to the gut. "How much time do we have?" "I'll file the papers today. A judge will hear the request for her protection within 48 hours. That's the law. The full hearing could be weeks, even months away." Winters got a fresh piece of paper. "I need Mrs. Rowe's full story. Can she make it to town?" "Not yet. Doc Harrison says she needs a few more days of complete rest." "Then I'll ride out to your place this afternoon. The sooner we file, the better." Winters paused. "Mr. Crowley, I need to be straight with you. This is going to get loud. The whole town will be talking. There will be gossip and worse. Are you ready for that?" "I am," Elias answered. "And Mrs. Rowe? Is she ready to have her private pain displayed for all to see?" "She will be." Winters looked at him hard. "You care for this woman." "I care about helping someone who's in trouble." "That's not what I asked." Elias met his gaze. 4 days ago, Elizabeth Rowe and her daughter came into my life. I've seen more grit in that 8-year-old girl than in most grown men. I've seen her mother fight to stay alive after a head injury that should have put her in the ground. It reminded me some things are worth fighting for, no matter how hard it is. So yes, I care, but not in the way you mean. Winters gave a slow nod. "Good. Because if people start to question your reasons, this whole thing falls apart." He stood and offered his hand. "I'll be at your ranch by 2 o'clock. Have her ready to talk." Mr. Winters pulled up at 2 o'clock sharp in a little buggy, a leather bag full of papers beside him. Elias met him in the yard and brought him inside. Elizabeth was waiting in the front room, wearing an old dress of Sarah's that was too big for her small frame. She stood up slow and careful as they came in. The lawyer, Mr. Winters, got right to the point. He said, "I understand you want a legal separation. But you need to know this will be hard. You will have to face your husband in court. You will have to tell everyone about the abuse. He will question you and try to make you look like a liar." Elizabeth's hand shook, but her voice was steady when she said, "I understand." Mr. Winters continued, "Your whole life will be put on display for the town to judge. Some will side with you, others will not. Are you ready for that?" She looked him right in the eye. "For the last 8 years, my husband has told me every single day that I am worthless and stupid. He has beaten me, starved me, and left me to suffer. I am not afraid of what strangers will say. I am afraid of going back to him. So yes, I am ready." Mr. Winters gave a firm nod. "Then let us begin. Tell me everything." For the next 3 hours, Elizabeth laid it all bare. She told him how Thomas had seemed so charming when they were courting, promising her a wonderful life. The first few months of marriage were peaceful enough, but looking back, she could now see all the warning signs she had missed. He would criticize her cooking, her cleaning, everything. He slowly cut her off from her family and friends. Then came the first time he grabbed her arm hard enough to leave a dark bruise, only to apologize so much she believed it was just an accident. "When did he start hitting you regularly?" Winters asked. "After we lost our first child," she said, her voice hollow. "I was 6 months pregnant. Thomas said it was my fault. He started drinking heavier after that, and the drinking made him mean. The slapping started a few months later, then the punching." She swallowed hard before adding, "and then worse." In the corner, Maggie made a small, pained sound. Elizabeth looked at her daughter, her own eyes filled with sorrow. "I am so sorry, sweetheart. I am sorry you have to hear any of this." "It is okay, Mama," Maggie whispered, tears running down her face. "Tell him everything." Elizabeth turned back to the lawyer. "We moved 5 times in 8 years, each place worse than the last. Thomas could never hold down a job or make a farm pay, but it was never his fault. It was always my fault, or the weather's fault. The worse things got, the more he drank, and the more he drank, the meaner he became." "Now tell me about what happened right before you came to Mr. Crowley's ranch," Winters said gently. She told him about the fall, about her head hitting the stove. She remembered waking up on the floor with Thomas standing over her, telling her to stop being dramatic and get up. She remembered being sick for 3 days while he did nothing until Maggie finally ran for help. "Are you certain he did not push you?" Elizabeth paused for a long moment. "I do not remember the fall itself. I was dizzy from not eating. I just reached for a pot and the whole world turned sideways. But Thomas was angry that morning. We had been arguing. I remember him yelling, and I remember backing away from him. The next thing I knew, I was on the floor." "So it is possible he pushed you," Winters stated. "It is possible," she whispered, "but I cannot swear to it." The lawyer made a note. "We will focus on what we can prove," he said. "The injury, his refusal to get you a doctor, and the years of abuse leading up to it. That should be enough." He then asked, "What is the nature of your relationship with Mr. Crowley?" "Mr. Crowley has shown my daughter and me nothing but kindness," she answered without hesitation. "He gave us a safe place to stay and a job. That is all. Your husband will claim otherwise. My husband can claim whatever he wants. It will not make it true. You know people will talk about an unmarried woman staying here. I know my reputation is already ruined just by leaving my husband. I would rather be whispered about for being improper than be mourned for being a fool who stayed until he killed me, Mr. Winters closed his notebook. "I believe we have what we need. The hearing for a temporary protection order will be in 2 days. You will need to be there." "I will be there," Elizabeth said. After the lawyer left, Elias found Elizabeth on the front porch. He sat down near her, giving her space. "I keep thinking about what people will say," she said softly. "Not about me. I do not care about that. But about you. You should not have your good name dragged through the mud for helping us." Elias looked out at the horizon. "I am a grown man. I can handle a little gossip." "It will be more than gossip," she insisted. "Thomas will spread terrible lies to turn people against you. You could still back out. I would understand." "Would you really?" Elias asked. "No," she admitted with a sad smile. "But I would pretend to. You have already done so much for us." "You are not asking for anything," he said. "I am offering." He turned to her. "Elizabeth, I know you are scared, but you are not alone anymore. Whatever Thomas does, we will face it together. Remember that." Her eyes welled up with tears. "I do not know how I can ever repay you." "You do not have to repay it," he said. "You just have to let us help." That night, Elias could not sleep. He thought about the court date in 2 days. He thought about how furious Thomas would be. He knew the town would sit in judgment and that the judge might not rule in their favor. He thought about the promise he made to his late wife, Sarah, to live a good life and help folks where he could. He thought about little Maggie, whose bravery had saved her mother. And he thought about Elizabeth, who had found the courage to speak up after so much suffering. In 2 days, they would stand in a courtroom and ask for protection. They would tell their story and hope it was enough. Nothing was guaranteed, but it was a chance. And sometimes a chance is all a person needs. As Elias lay there, a feeling he had not known in 3 long years settled deep in his bones. It was not happiness, not yet, but it was purpose. It was the feeling that what he was doing mattered. And he knew that feeling would be enough to see him through whatever came next. Have you ever had to face your worst nightmare, knowing the whole system was built to protect them, not you? That's where Elizabeth Rowe found herself, on the steps of a courthouse that stood for a justice that was rarely given to women like her. This story is about the incredible courage it takes to speak up. It's a reminder that one person's bravery can change everything. If you believe in the power of the underdog, you need to hear this. The day started before the sun came up. Elizabeth got dressed in a borrowed dress, her hands shaking so bad she could barely pin up her hair. Twice she had to stop and catch her breath, fighting off the dizziness from the injury that brought them all here. Elias, her friend, told her, "You don't have to do this." But she did. Turning back meant giving up, and that was not an option. She whispered, "Yes, I do." When they walked through the big oak doors, their lawyer, Jacob Winters, was there waiting. He nodded at them, his face giving nothing away. He told them, "Judge Morrison is a fair man, but he's old-fashioned. We need to let the facts do the talking." "What about Thomas?" Elizabeth asked, her voice just a whisper. "Will he be here?" Mr. Winters said, "He was told about the hearing. If he shows up, you can't let him scare you. The judge will be watching." Inside, the courtroom was not empty. A few folks from town were there, and a welcome sight. Doc Harrison sat right in the front row. But then, at the other table, sat her husband, Thomas. He had a slick-looking lawyer with him. Thomas locked his eyes on Elizabeth. The hate in his gaze was so strong it felt like a punch, and she couldn't help but flinch. Elias stepped a little to the side, putting himself between them. Then the bailiff called out, "All rise!" and in walked Judge Arthur Morrison. He was a man in his 60s with white hair and a face that told no stories. He sat down and looked over the room, not surprised by any of it. "Be seated," the judge said. "I see we have a petition for a legal separation." Mr. Winters stood up. "Yes, Your Honor. Elizabeth Rowe is asking to be separated from her husband, Thomas Rowe, because he has been cruel and put her life in danger. We are also asking for an order of protection." The judge looked to the other table. "And you are?" "Charles Brennan, Your Honor. I represent Mr. Thomas Rowe. We are here to fight this. This is just a little spat between a husband and wife being stirred up by outsiders with their own agendas." The judge looked back at Mr. Winters. "Present your case," Winters began, his voice calm and steady. "Your Honor, 6 days ago, Elizabeth suffered a terrible head injury, a cracked skull with bleeding on the brain. Instead of getting his wife a doctor, Mr. Rowe left her to suffer for 3 days. Her condition got so bad," Winters continued, "that her 8-year-old daughter had to walk 5 miles barefoot to get help from a neighbor. That girl's courage is the only reason her mother is alive today." A quiet murmur went through the room. "I'd like to call Dr. William Harrison to the stand." Doc Harrison was sworn in. He explained the terrible state he found Elizabeth in. He described the cracked skull and the signs of brain bleeding. Winters asked, "In your medical opinion, what would have happened if she had not gotten help when she did?" "She would have died," Doc Harrison said, plain and simple. "Probably within 24 hours. Brennan, the other lawyer, stood up. "Doctor, you're just relying on the word of an 8-year-old child, aren't you?" "I am relying on the medical evidence," the doctor shot back. "Any man with eyes could see she was gravely ill." Brennan pushed. "But you can't say for sure what Mr. Rowe was thinking, can you?" The doctor's jaw got tight. "No," he admitted, "I cannot." Brennan sat down, looking pleased with himself. Then Winters called Elizabeth to the stand. She walked so slowly, her hand trembling as she placed it on the Bible. Her voice was so quiet you could barely hear her swear the oath. Mr. Winters asked her gently, "Mrs. Rowe, can you please tell the court about your marriage? When did the abuse start?" Elizabeth took a deep, shaky breath. "It started about 6 months after we were married. First, it was just words. Then he started pushing me. The first time he hit me was after I lost our first baby." How often did it happen? Winters asked. At first, maybe once a month, then once a week. Lately, it was almost every day. Can you describe what he would do? Elizabeth's voice went flat, like she was talking about someone else. Slapping, punching. He broke my arm once and told everyone I fell. Sometimes he wouldn't let me eat. She stopped and had to swallow hard before she could continue. He would force himself on me. He said it was his right as my husband. The entire courtroom fell silent. Now, Mrs. Rowe, tell us about the day you were injured. We were arguing about money he spent on whiskey. I told him Maggie and I needed food. He got angry and started yelling. I backed away, and the next thing I knew, I was on the floor. Thomas just stood over me, telling me to stop being so dramatic. I couldn't get up. I was sick. Maggie begged him to get the doctor, but he said we couldn't afford it. He said I was just faking it. Tears ran down Elizabeth's face. I was terrified. I thought he was going to kill me, and my little girl would be left all alone with him. So your daughter took matters into her own hands? Yes. She waited for Thomas to leave for Austin. Then she walked to the Crowley ranch for help. Elizabeth's voice cracked. She walked 5 miles on roads hot enough to blister her feet, all because she was brave and desperate, and no one would listen. Winters let the silence hang in the room. Mrs. Rowe, why ask for a separation now? Because now I have a safe place to go. Someone is willing to help us. Before, I had nothing. No money, no family, no place to run. Thomas made sure I knew it too. He said I'd never make it on my own. She looked straight at the judge. But I am not worthless. My daughter deserves more than a life watching her mother get hurt. I'm asking you, Your Honor, to give us a chance at a different life. Brennan, the opposing lawyer, stepped forward like he was about to kick over a sandcastle. Mrs. Rowe, you say my client was violent. Where are the permanent marks? I have them, Elizabeth said softly. On my ribs from his boots? On my back from his belt? Do you want me to show the court? That is not necessary, the judge cut in. Continue, Mr. Brennan. You claim Mr. Rowe forced himself on you. As his wife, are you not legally obligated to perform certain duties? Elias's hands tightened into fists. A wedding ring does not give a man the right to hurt his wife, Elizabeth said, her chin high. The word no should mean something. If you do not believe that, Mr. Brennan, then I feel sorry for your wife. A few chuckles came from the gallery. Brennan's face turned beet red. You are living with Mr. Elias Crowley, are you not? A widower, with no other woman in the house. I am recovering from a serious injury in a home where I am treated with respect. Mr. Crowley has been a perfect gentleman. And you expect us to believe a man takes in a pretty woman out of pure kindness with no expectation of some gratitude? I expect the court to believe the truth, Elizabeth said, her voice firm. Mr. Crowley is a good man who helped a person in need. If you cannot understand simple decency, that says more about your character than it does about his. Your Honor, Brennan said, this is just a story they cooked up to cover for their affair. My client has a rough manner, but he's a working man. His wife is either exaggerating or lying outright, all so she can run off with another man. That is not true, Maggie's voice shot through the courtroom. She stood up, her small body trembling with anger. Mr. Crowley never laid a hand on my mother in a bad way. He saved her life. He was kind when Papa was mean. If you can't tell the difference between a good man and a bad one, you are just plain blind. Young lady, sit down, the judge said, though his voice was gentle. No, sir. Maggie's voice shook, but she stood her ground. You all keep talking about the law and what is proper, but no one is asking what is true. The truth is, my papa hurt my mama. The truth is, I walked 5 miles on burning hot ground because I knew she would die if I did not get help. The truth is, Mr. Crowley opened his door when everyone else turned us away. Maggie, her mother whispered. I just want my mama to be safe, Maggie cried, tears now streaming down her cheeks. I do not care if people talk about us or if we are poor. I just want her alive and away from him. Is that so wrong? The courtroom was completely still. You could have heard a pin drop. Judge Morrison took off his glasses, polished them, and put them back on. Young lady, what is your name? Margaret Elizabeth Rose, sir, but everyone calls me Maggie. Maggie, I appreciate your honesty, but this is a court, and I need to hear facts from the adult witnesses, not feelings. Do you understand? Yes, sir. But are not facts just the truth, with all the feelings taken out? And the feelings matter too, don't they? The corner of the judge's mouth twitched. Sometimes they do. Please, sit down now. Maggie sat, and Elias put a supportive hand on her shoulder. She was shaking, but the stubborn set of her jaw reminded him of Sarah. Mr. Winters, the judge said, do you have another witness? Yes. I call Mr. Elias Crowley to the stand. Elias's heart pounded as he walked to the stand and placed his hand on the Bible. He swore the oath and then turned to face Winters. Mr. Crowley, please tell the court how you came to be involved in this matter. Elias began to speak, telling them about the little girl who appeared on his porch, desperate and hurt. He described finding Elizabeth barely conscious and the choice he made to bring her home. Winters asked Elias point blank, why did you offer Mrs. Rowe a place to stay? Elias's answer was simple. Because she and her daughter needed it. They had nowhere else to turn. The other lawyer, Brennan, wasn't buying it. He looked at Elias with calculating eyes. Mr. Crowley, you are a widower, correct? Elias nodded. For 3 years now, Brennan continued, and in all that time, you have not courted a single woman. But now a beautiful lady in distress appears, and you welcome her right into your home. Mighty convenient timing, don't you think? Elias held his gaze. It had nothing to do with timing. It had to do with her little girl asking me for help, and me being able to give it. But Brennan pushed on. Are you telling this court you feel nothing more than charity for Mrs. Rowe? That you are not hoping this little arrangement turns into something more? Elias met the lawyer's stare without flinching. I am telling this court that I helped someone who was in desperate need with no strings attached. If you find that suspicious, well, that says a whole lot more about you than it does about me. Brennan tried one last trap. Mr. Crowley, if this court orders Mrs. Rowe to return to her husband, will you comply? The question hung heavy in the air. I would obey the court's legal ruling, Elias said, choosing his words with care. But I would also make it known to anyone who would listen that sending a woman back to a man who nearly killed her once is the same as signing her death warrant. Brennan sneered. So you would make trouble. Elias shook his head. I would tell the truth. Whether that is trouble or not depends on who is listening. The judge dismissed him, and then Thomas, the husband, took the stand. He wore an expression of pure, wounded pride that made Elias's hands clench into fists. Thomas spun a tale of being a hard-working farmer just trying to do his best. He said that, yes, he and Elizabeth argued, but what couple did not? He claimed he never meant to hurt her. My wife has always been a delicate woman, Thomas said, his voice slick with fake concern. She is prone to making things sound worse than they are. I think that neighbor of ours has filled her head with foolish ideas. When asked about the abuse, he said, I have disciplined my wife when she needed it, as is my right. But I have never beaten her like she claims. A firm hand on her arm, and suddenly, I am a monster. He even blamed his own daughter. She is only 8 years old. She has been coached by a man who wants to break up my family. Elias's lawyer, Winters, stood up, his fury barely contained. Mr. Rowe, your wife had a skull fracture. Are you telling us that happened because she bruises easy? Thomas stammered. I am telling you she fell and hit her head. And for 3 days, Winters pressed, your wife was terribly sick from this head injury and you did not think to get a doctor? We do not have money for doctors for every little complaint, Thomas snapped back. A skull fracture is not a little complaint, Mr. Rowe, Winters said coldly. And what about your daughter? She walked 5 miles barefoot to get help. What kind of home makes a child that desperate? Thomas's voice rose with anger. The kind where some lonely widower decides he wants another man's wife and uses her injury as an excuse to move in on her. So you believe Mr. Crowley is trying to steal your wife? Winters asked. I believe he saw a chance and he took it, Thomas snarled. And my wife, confused from her injury, is going along with it. I want them home. Winters let the silence hang in the courtroom. Even if bringing them home might kill your wife. Thomas caught himself, struggling for control. My wife will be fine once she is away from people filling her head with nonsense. The lawyers gave their closing arguments. Brennan painted Elias as a meddler destroying a sacred marriage. Winters laid out the cold, hard facts, the doctor's report, the child's desperate plea, and the simple truth that sending Elizabeth back would be a death sentence. Then Judge Morrison leaned back in his chair. I am going to take a brief recess to consider the evidence. Those 30 minutes felt like an eternity. Finally, they were called back in. Judge Morrison's face gave nothing away. This court recognizes the sanctity of marriage, he began. However, marriage is not a license for cruelty. A husband's authority is not absolute. Elias felt Elizabeth's cold, trembling hand find his. The medical evidence, the judge continued, is clear and disturbing. Mrs. Rowe sustained a life-threatening injury and was denied care for 3 days. That fact alone is unforgivable. Morrison looked directly at Thomas. Furthermore, Mr. Rowe's testimony, where he called a skull fracture a little complaint, shows a man who either does not understand or does not care about the severity of his wife's condition. As for the accusations against Mr. Crowley, I find no evidence to support them. Judge Morrison stared down at Elizabeth with eyes that missed nothing. Mrs. Rowe, I am granting you a temporary order of protection. Thomas Rowe is to have no contact whatsoever with you or your little girl. We will have the full hearing in 6 weeks. If he so much as breathes in your direction, he will be arrested on the spot. A choked sob of relief escaped Elizabeth's lungs, and her daughter Maggie buried her face in her shoulder. But let's be crystal clear, the judge's voice cut like steel. This is just temporary. You use these 6 weeks to build a case that can stand on its own. And Mr. Crowley, he fixed his gaze on Elias. I admire a man helping his neighbors, but y'all be sure to keep everything above board. Do you understand me? Yes, Your Honor, Elias said. With a sharp crack of the gavel, it was done. We won, she whispered outside, the words tasting like a miracle. He can't get near us. Winters, their lawyer, stepped up beside them. For 6 weeks, he cautioned. That is how long we have to forge a case so strong a team of mules couldn't pull it apart. This was just the first skirmish, not the whole war. I understand, Elizabeth said, her voice gaining strength. But right now, I am going to be thankful for this victory. Back at the wagon, little Maggie was already skipping, a sight Elias hadn't seen in days. As he helped Elizabeth onto the seat, she turned to him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Thank you, she said, her voice thick, for believing in us when no one else on earth would. No thanks are necessary, Elias replied. Oh, yes, they are, she insisted. What you are doing. It matters more than you will ever know. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence. They had 6 weeks. It was not a lifetime, but it was a start. And as Elias guided the horses home, he reckoned that sometimes a start is all a person truly needs. In those 6 weeks, life settled into a new rhythm. The angry sores on Maggie's feet healed into the tough skin of a country child. Elizabeth's strength returned, the color blooming in her cheeks again. The ranch itself seemed to breathe easier with 3 sets of hands sharing the load. Elizabeth ran the house with a quiet competence that came from years of making something out of nothing. She put in a garden, mended Elias's clothes, and cooked meals that made the old ranch house feel like a home once more. Maggie, a quick and eager learner, took to feeding the chickens and milking the cow. In the evenings, her young voice would fill the front room with stories from books she found on the shelves. It was a peaceful time, but the shadow of the hearing loomed over them like a Texas thunderhead. Thomas was too sly to violate the order directly. Instead, his presence was a ghost on the wind, a fence cut clean in the night. Cattle mysteriously moved from one pasture to another, small acts of malice that sent a clear message. All the while, Winters built their case, piece by painstaking piece. He interviewed neighbors who'd heard the screaming through thin walls and documented every story that could be proven. "They will try to break you on the stand," Winters told Elizabeth plainly. "They will call you a liar, a cheater, an unfit mother. You have to stay calm and tell the plain truth." "I know," she answered quietly. "I have been preparing for this my entire marriage. This is just the first time the truth might have a chance." The night before the court date, Elias found sleep was a world away. He rose from the sofa he'd been using and stepped out onto the porch, under a vast sky littered with stars. The screen door creaked behind him. It was Elizabeth, wrapped in a shawl. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked. "I keep thinking about what happens if we lose," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "That is not going to happen," Elias said with a certainty he did not feel. "But if it does," she went on, her face pale in the moonlight, "I want you to know that these weeks here have been the first time in 8 years I have felt like a person instead of property. Whatever happens, that was worth fighting for. And I need a promise. If I have to go back, you promise me you will take care of Maggie. Get her away from him." "Stop!" Elias turned to her, his voice sharp. "You are not going back. Neither of you. I will not let that happen. You may not have a choice in the matter." "There is always a choice," he stated. "If that judge rules against us, I will marry you myself, that very afternoon. The law says a new marriage overrides an old one. Thomas would have no more claim on you." Elizabeth stared at him, stunned into silence. "You cannot. Elias, you can't throw your life away for us." "This is not throwing anything away. It is a practical answer to a legal problem, a marriage just for protection." "It is not fair to you," she whispered. "Fair does not enter into it," Elias replied, his voice level. "What about your future? Finding someone to love?" "I had that," he said quietly, a deep sadness in his voice. "I had my Sarah. I'm not looking to replace her. But I can use what I have left, my name, my land, to protect someone who needs it. To me, that seems like a fair trade." Tears were now streaming down Elizabeth's face. "Why are you so determined to save us?" "Because someone has to be," he said simply. He started to reach for her, but hesitated. She closed the small distance between them and took his hand in both of hers. "If we lose," she said, her voice shaking, "I will accept your offer. But Elias, if we win, I want you to know I am staying here because I want to. Because for the first time in years, I can see a future that does not scare me to death." They stood there in the quiet dark, hands clasped, drawing strength from one another for whatever the morning would bring, a fragile smile. Together. I'm still learning what that word means. The courtroom was even more crowded this time. Word had spread, and folks came to see a woman stand up to her husband. Some looked on with sympathy. Others were there for the show. Elias sat with Elizabeth, with Maggie right between them. The little girl wore a new calico dress, and Elizabeth herself looked stronger. The color was back in her cheeks, but Elias saw her hands trembling. Thomas came in with his lawyer, and Elizabeth flinched. He looked like a cornered animal, his eyes burning with a hateful promise. Judge Morrison took his seat. "We are here for the full hearing on the petition for legal separation filed by Elizabeth Rowe against her husband, Thomas Rowe. Both parties have had adequate time to prepare their cases. Mr. Winters, you may proceed. Have you ever seen a real injustice and wondered if one person could make a difference? That is what this story is all about. It is about a good man who stepped in to help a woman and her child escape a monster, and the courtroom battle that followed. The next 3 hours in that courthouse laid the whole ugly truth bare for everyone to see. Mr. Winters called one person after another to the stand, building a case so strong that no amount of clever lawyering could tear it down. A neighbor testified to hearing terrible screams coming from their cabin late at night. She talked about seeing Elizabeth with blackened eyes and a split lip. A local shopkeeper spoke about Thomas's heavy drinking and his explosive temper. Doc Harrison came back to the stand, not just with notes on her head injury, but with years of medical records. He showed the court a long history of broken bones, burns, and bruises that all pointed to a brutal pattern of abuse. Through it all, Elizabeth sat there, pale but composed. When it was her turn, she told the story of her marriage with a steady, honest voice. She did not flinch from the painful details. Brennan, the other lawyer, tried his best to paint her as a liar, but she met every one of his accusations with the calm, simple truth. She said, "I am not here out of hate. I am here because I want to live, and I want my daughter to know her life has value." Then it was little Maggie's turn. The judge was hesitant to let a child testify, but Winters insisted she was the only one who saw everything. With her small hand on the Bible, she swore to tell the truth, her voice clear as a bell. Winters asked her gently, "Maggie, did you ever see your father hit your mother?" She answered, "Yes, sir, many times." He asked, "Can you tell us what you saw?" Maggie described how he would hit her mother with his hand, his fist, or even a belt. How he would knock her down and then kick her. How he would grab her by the hair and slam her head into the wall. She spoke like she was reading from a book, her voice never shaking. "Once," she said, "he broke her arm because supper was not ready. He told everyone she fell, but I saw him do it." Winters then asked, "Were you afraid of him?" "Yes, sir," she replied. "Did he ever hurt you?" Maggie paused, and for the first time she looked like she might cry. "Not like he hurt Mama," she said. "But he would hit me if I did something wrong, and he promised he would hurt me much worse if I ever told anyone what he did to her." "Is that why you did not tell anyone sooner?" Winters asked. "I tried," Maggie said, her voice now just a whisper. "I told Mr. Paulson at the feed store. I told Mrs. Henderson after church. They just said it was family business. So I stopped asking for help until Mama got so sick I thought she was going to die. After that, I did not care anymore. I just had to try." "Why did you go to Mr. Crowley's ranch?" She looked right at Elias with tears finally in her eyes. "Because I saw it from the road once. It looked peaceful, like a place where good people would live," she added. "And I was right. He is a good man. He helped us." Even the opposing lawyer Brennan cut his question short. He knew that attacking a little girl who had been through so much would not help his case. Finally, Thomas took the stand again. He stuck to his story that he was a good husband and that Elizabeth was an unstable liar. He claimed the whole thing was a plot by Elias Crowley to steal his wife. But on cross-examination, Winters took him apart. "Mr. Rowe," he asked, "you have heard many people testify about your violence. Are all of them lying?" "They are mistaken," Thomas said. "And what about your own daughter? When she said she saw you break her mother's arm, was she lying too?" "She is only 8 years old," Thomas snapped. "She does not understand what she saw." "So you're telling this court your wife is just clumsy, Mr. Rowe? 8 years of broken bones, concussions, and burns because she can't watch her step?" The judge's voice was low and steady. Thomas Rowe's face turned a deep red. "What happens in my house is my business." The judge leaned forward. "Not anymore. Not when what happens in your house almost put her in the ground." After both lawyers had their say, the judge, Mr. Morrison, took off his spectacles. "I'm ready to make my decision," he said, and the room went quiet. "This case has been a heavy weight, not because the law is confusing, but because the truth of it is so ugly. Mr. Rowe, you claim to be a good husband, but the evidence tells a different story. We have doctors' reports. We have neighbors who saw your temper, and we have the words of your own little girl who spoke with a courage that shames you. A marriage is a sacred thing, the judge continued, his voice getting harder, but it is not a permission slip for cruelty. A husband is meant to protect his wife, not break her. You let her suffer from a life-threatening injury out of sheer pride. That alone is enough. Under the table, Elizabeth squeezed Elias's hand. Therefore, the petition for legal separation is granted. Elizabeth Rowe, you are hereby free from Thomas Rowe. You will have full custody of your daughter, Margaret. Mr. Rowe, you are ordered to stay 500 feet away from them. No contact. None. Elizabeth let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. Furthermore, Judge Morrison said, you will pay child support of $5 a month until Margaret turns 18. Thomas shot up from his chair. $5? I can hardly feed myself. Sit down, the judge said, his voice like ice, or you'll spend the night in jail thinking about the choices that brought you here. Thomas sat, shaking with a rage you could feel across the room. The judge's tone softened as he looked at Elizabeth. Ma'am, you are free. Free to live where you want, work where you want. He has no more say over you. I hope you use this freedom to build a good life for you and that little girl. You've earned it. The gavel came down, and it was done. For a second, nobody moved. Then Elizabeth turned and wrapped her arms around Elias, burying her face in his shoulder. Maggie rushed in, hugging them both. Elias held them close. These two souls who had stumbled into his life and changed everything. We won, Elizabeth whispered. You won, Elias corrected her gently. As they walked out, Elias saw Thomas by the door, his eyes locking onto his with pure, uncut hatred. Elias just stared back for a moment before turning his back, guiding Elizabeth and Maggie toward the doors and out into the sunshine. The law was on their side now. Back at the ranch, things felt quiet but joyful. Maggie couldn't stop talking about how she'd never have to go back to that awful cabin. Elizabeth, however, seemed to be in a daze. I keep thinking I'm going to wake up, she said softly. It's real, Elias promised her. You're both free. That evening, Elias found her in the garden she had planted. You've had a long day, he said. She stood up, brushing dirt from her hands. Elias, I need to ask you something. That offer, to marry me if we lost, was that just a backup plan? He thought for a moment. When I first made the offer, it was a practical way to protect you. A legal move. He paused. But now, I don't know. These past few weeks, he admitted, having you and Maggie here, it's reminded me what it feels like to have a home, to have a purpose again. I'm not saying I'm in love with you, but I'm not ready for you to leave either. Elizabeth offered a small smile. I'm not planning on leaving. We're happy here. But you need to know I can't replace what you lost. I'm not Sarah. I know, he said, meeting her gaze. And I'm not asking you to be. All I'm asking is if you'd be willing to stay on, as you are, as my friend. Maybe one day it becomes something more, and maybe it doesn't. Either way is all right with me. She looked out at the ranch, the warm lights glowing in the house. That suits me just fine, she said. The months passed peacefully. The lonely ranch house slowly turned back into a real home. Maggie started school and blossomed, finally free from the shadow of fear. But small towns have long memories. One day, Maggie came home crying because some older girls at school had called her mother a cruel name. Elizabeth pulled her daughter close. Let them talk, sweet girl. We know the truth, and that's what matters. But it's not fair, Maggie cried. Fairness isn't about what people say, Elizabeth explained, smoothing her hair. It's about what we do. Those girls, they don't know me. Their words can't change who I am. She lifted her daughter's chin. Now you listen to me. You are not responsible for what other people think. You are only responsible for your own truth and your own actions. I want you to hold your head high and know your own worth, no matter what anybody else says. That's the only way forward." Maggie nodded, wiping her tears. And in that small kitchen she understood. They were free, not just from a man, but from the fear of what others might think. And that was the greatest freedom of all. After the divorce, the child support payments from Thomas were supposed to come every month, but they hardly ever did. Winters wanted to take him back to court, but Elizabeth said no. "I do not want his money," she told Elias. "I just want him out of our lives." Elias understood. Some fights just are not worth the trouble. Word got around town that Thomas had left the area, maybe headed north to Montana or Wyoming. Nobody knew for sure, and nobody really cared. He had made too many enemies with his drinking and his temper. His leaving was seen as good riddance. Elizabeth heard the news with a quiet sigh of relief. As the seasons changed from summer to fall, life on the ranch settled into a comfortable routine. Elias proudly taught Maggie how to ride a horse, and she took to it with a fierce determination. Elizabeth learned the rhythms of the ranch, mastering chores that would have seemed impossible just a year before. They worked together during the harvest, canning vegetables for the long winter ahead. And slowly, so slowly you could barely see it happening, the feelings between Elias and Elizabeth started to change. It was in the small things, like a hand that lingered for just a moment too long at the supper table. It was in the way their eyes would meet across the room. One evening, as the October sun was setting, they sat on the porch watching Maggie play. The air was crisp and cool. "Can I ask you something?" Elizabeth said softly. "Of course," he replied. "Back before the trial, you offered to marry me just to protect me. You said it would be in name only." She took a breath. "Does that offer still stand?" Elias felt his heart start to pound. "Are you asking if I would still marry you?" he asked. "No," she said. "I am asking if you would be willing to marry me for real this time. As a choice we both want to make." He looked at her, searching her face. He saw no sense of duty, only a quiet certainty. "I love you," Elizabeth said, her voice clear and simple. "It is not because you rescued me, even though you did. I love you because you are a kind and patient man. You make me laugh and you listen to me. You treat Maggie like she is important. When I think about my future, I just cannot imagine it without you in it." Elias felt a lump form in his throat. "Elizabeth," he started. "I know I am not Sarah," she went on. "I can never replace what you lost. But I can be myself, and I can love you as myself, if you will let me." He reached out and took her hand. "I love you too," he said, the words feeling new and right. "I never expected it, but somewhere along the way, you stopped being the woman I was helping and became the woman I cannot live without." Her eyes filled with tears. "So is that a yes?" He smiled. "That is a yes." They were married 3 weeks later in a quiet church ceremony. Doc Harrison stood up for Elias, and the schoolteacher stood for Elizabeth. Maggie walked down this aisle as the flower girl, looking as serious as a judge. The town had mixed feelings. Some folks were genuinely happy for them. Others gossiped about how quickly it all happened. Hot for a few weeks, but soon faded. Elizabeth and Elias did not care. They had built a real family out of the ashes of their lives. The ranch thrived under their care. Maggie grew into a smart and confident young woman who became a teacher. Elizabeth never forgot what it felt like to be trapped and helpless. She became a quiet source of strength for other women in town, offering a safe place to anyone who needed it. Elias once teased her, "You are going to get a reputation." She just smiled and said, "Might as well earn it." They eventually had children of their own, a boy and then twin girls. Maggie loved them fiercely, the perfect older sister. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, Elias would think about the path that brought them all together. A barefoot child walking across the hot ground, a desperate plea for help, and a choice to do the right thing when it was easier to look away. "What are you thinking about?" Elizabeth would ask him. About how close we all came to a different life, he would say. Do you ever regret it? Getting involved in my mess? Never, Elias said, his voice firm. Not for 1 second. My life before you was simple and empty. You and Maggie filled it with purpose and with love. That is not a complication. That is a gift. Elizabeth kissed him. I used to think survival was the best I could hope for. You taught me I was wrong. You taught me something too, Elias said. That broken things can be mended. That family is not just about blood. It is about choosing to show up for each other. We have built something good here, have we not? We have, Elias agreed. Something worth fighting for, model. Elias stood right where he'd first seen her, watching his kids holler and play in the yard. His wife, Elizabeth, was hanging laundry on the line, looking as real as the mirage she once seemed to be. He never forgot the day a little girl with torn-up feet walked out of the heat haze and changed everything. That day taught him that you don't just stand by when someone's hurting. You step up. That choice is the only thing that truly matters. Maggie, now grown with a baby of her own, came and stood by him. A penny for your thoughts, old man, he smiled. Just remembering the day you showed up here, walking all that way, that must have hurt something fierce. I still got the scars, Maggie said, flexing her bare toes in the grass. But they remind me I did something that mattered. Makes them easier to carry. You were so brave, Elias said, his voice a low rumble. Braver than any 8-year-old ought to be. I was desperate, she said softly, but I was also lucky. Lucky you were the kind of man who opens the door for a stranger. Lucky you didn't just look the other way. Darling, I'm the lucky one, Elias told her. You and your mama gave me a reason to do more than just get by. You gave me a life. Maggie leaned her head on his shoulder. Is Mama happy? I mean, really and truly happy? Elias looked over at Elizabeth, who was laughing at something one of the kids said. Her whole face was lit up with a joy so pure it could make the bluebonnets jealous. Yeah, I reckon she is. Good, Maggie sighed. I want to remember this. All of it. So I can tell my son about the day we walked across that hot ground, refusing to give up. About the man who helped us when nobody else would. And how sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help. And sometimes the best thing you can do is say yes, Elias added. That's a good story, he said. It's our story, Maggie corrected. As the sun bled gold and crimson across the Texas sky, the whole family gathered on the porch. Laughter and stories bounced around the comfortable chaos of folks who truly belonged together. Elizabeth caught his eye from across the table and gave him a smile that held everything they had built. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was worth every single struggle. Later that night, with the house settled and quiet, Elias stood by the window looking out over the land he'd worked for 40 years. Elizabeth was sleeping soundly behind him, no longer chased by the ghosts of a man who tried to break her spirit. His children were dreaming safe and sound in the next room. He thought back to that afternoon when that little girl appeared walking toward a sliver of hope, with feet that bled with every step. He thought about the choice he made to help, and the life that grew from that one single decision to care. Some folks talk about fate, like your path is all laid out for you. Elias didn't buy that. He believed in choices. He believed every morning you wake up, you decide who you're going to be. You decide if you're going to step forward or look away. He believed in little barefoot girls with more grit than a whole posse of grown men. He believed in mothers who fight for their kids with their last ounce of strength. And he believed that broken things can heal if you just give them enough time, care, and love. The journey hadn't been smooth, but they'd walked it together. They hadn't avoided pain. But Lord, they had found a way to heal. Their life wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. Built from the ground up and defended with everything they had. The ranch house was quiet, resting easy under a whole sky full of Texas stars. The ghosts of the past were still there, he supposed, but they were gentle now. They were just reminders of how far they'd all come. Tomorrow would bring its own troubles and its own choices. But tonight, they were safe. They were warm. They were together. And that, Elias thought as he finally turned to join his wife, was more than enough. That was everything. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.